Hungary is an illustration of a country that saw its democracy gradually etched away, hollowed out, but has demonstrated that it came back with a vengeance, and it was very much resilient. But we're also seeing someone else try to do that in the United States, and obviously that's where we both were speaking with one another in person. And so when you apply the principles of Hungary to what Trump's doing in America, how do you see it?
Yeah, for the first time, I think, in history, we're really seeing that, certainly since the Civil War, I would say, we're really seeing that devolve in the US in relatively comprehensive terms. And so I'm not going to go, and list all of the ways in which that Trump, I think, is trying to undo the democratic building blocks of the United States, I think.
This is the Global Gambit.
You're watching the Global Gambit with me, Pyotr, a podcast that looks at geopolitics, economics, international relations, and often looks at democracy as well and how it exists or doesn't, or is being fought for or being lost to. We had an interesting conversation with The Economist a couple of weeks ago about its democracy index, but this time we're looking at what it actually means to be fighting and defending it. And I'm delighted to be re-hosting a guest that we had on a good couple of years ago now, Uriel Epstein, who is the founder and CEO of Renew Democracy Initiative, or RDI, which is a non-profit focused on defending liberal democracy against authoritarianism, political extremism, democratic backsliding, populism and such. And given the events in Hungary, what Ukraine is fighting for, what a lot of countries and communities are fighting for, I'm delighted to have Uriel back on. Uriel, it's been a while, but your work is very important. And I think you recently held a gala, which I was kind enough to be invited to. And one of the themes that was really prevalent there was the common themes across the world of fighting for democracy, be it in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ukraine, in Hungary, in Latin America. And I just wanted to get a sense from you how you see the lay of the land right now.
Absolutely. So Pyotr, thank you so much for having me back on. It's been a few years, yeah. So look, RDI, our whole shtick is trying to highlight the fight for democracy, not in theoretical terms, right? Not in the way that you would discuss democracy in a classroom or in a faculty lounge, but really to get a sense of what it takes in practice to fight for it. So the gala that you're referencing, we call it our Heroes of Democracy Gala, because what we want to do is we want to honor those who take risks in the fight for freedom, right? Not just those who are sitting around a classroom talking, writing columns and so forth, but people who have actually taken real risk, whether that's, physical risk to their physical safety or political risk if they're a political figure and so forth. So at this event, we're very careful to try to highlight the actions of those across the globe. And so this year we honored from the US, one Democrat, one Republican. We honored Senator Mark Kelly and Ambassador John Bolton. We believe that both of these individuals have stood by their principles despite significant threats, both political and physical. Chrystia Freeland, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Canada, who is on one of Russia's lists and so forth, really taken some risks to try to bring Canada into the fold, into the fight against dictatorship. And last but not least, Bobby Wine, who is the Ugandan opposition leader. And I say opposition leader only because he should be the actual leader of Uganda, a country of 50 million people. But of the elections in which he was the primary candidate against the Museveni, the incumbent, were, of course, essentially stolen, actually stolen, not stolen in a made-up sense of the word, but they were actually stolen. And Bobby ended up having to go into exile after having spent weeks in hiding, where he was literally going from kind of basement to basement from different friends. And finally, he made it to America. A couple days after he came into DC, I had dinner with him and his wife. And, some of the stories that he told from there were just kind of beyond belief, to think that this could actually be happening and Western countries could be working with the dictatorship of Uganda. But these are the types of stories that we want to connect to one another, because I believe that they are connected. Canada's role on the global stage, Senator Kelly, Ambassador Bolton, and Bobby Wine, each of their individual fights relate to one another. And looking forward to sort of parsing that out over the course of the conversation.
Yeah, certainly. It was a very impactful evening and a lot of takeaways. excited to say to viewers and listeners that Senator Kelly will be joining the show at some point in the next month or so to bring on, and we're chatting about hopefully bringing on Bobby as well, Uriel. So there's going to be a lot of important, I think, opportunities to listen from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But one of the other things that I find just very notable about trying to fight for democracy in a physical sense and in a literal sense is the lengths that people are willing to go to do that. And I'm just kind of curious from the sort of perspective you have working with in RDI, like how do you help facilitate that? How do you help people support in preventing democratic backsliding or reversing democracy and fatigue?
So it's a few different things. So first, the biggest thing that RDI does is we have a network called the Front Lines of Freedom. The premise of this is to bring together political dissidents from all over the world, from oppressive countries all around the world, in order to offer a positive message about the inspirational qualities of what you and I have in our respective countries, you in the UK, me in the US, and in general, that people in free societies have come to take for granted. Because so many of us, I think, have become kind of like fish in water, where we do not recognize the thing that exists all around us and the thing that enables us to live and breathe freely. Whereas those who have lived under oppressive governments, those who have suffered, whether directly at the hands of dictators or seen their friends and their families get arrested, get harassed, sometimes get killed, these people are incredibly well positioned to give us some perspective as to what it is that we get to enjoy and the importance of defending it. And so I think that's kind of a unique position. I call it kind of a Tocquevillian approach to democracy, which is to say an outside-in perspective from those who know what the alternative to the American system is, to the British system. And I think that they're uniquely positioned to break through people's partisan echo chambers. Because again, you can be on the left or you could be on the right. And when you're listening to someone whose wife was raped by, authoritarian forces, right, while having been arrested in prison, or who has seen their friends get killed, or who simply has seen all of their assets taken away by a dictator, listening to that person, it's difficult to think, oh, we should get rid of our system. We should blow it up and start from scratch, right? Folks who have had these types of horrific experiences can put into perspective what a lot of folks, Pyotr, who have had our experiences, it gives people, I think, a different perspective than what they've had.
No, certainly. And what we see, I think, is this big emphasis of the Biden administration, to put it more specifically, put the framing of his government, at least early on, as a tug of war between democracies and autocracies. And in this case, Trump seems to have shifted the rhetoric towards more just might is right and strongman, and a sense of almost adulation for people like Putin, for President Xi Jinping, even Kim Jong-un of North Korea. But, as a country that is often, I think, symbolized as defending democracy on the front lines is Ukraine. And a lot of the work that you do is linked to those who have been involved with the war, who are veterans, who've been in the government. So when looking at Ukraine specifically, how do you see the situation?
Yeah. So Ukraine is literally, I think, represents the literal front lines of freedom. So I just got back from Ukraine a few weeks ago. I led an RDI delegation there of business leaders and journalists, specifically, number one, to highlight voices of Ukraine. We want to bring back the stories of these folks who have just, risked everything in order to try to maintain their freedom to an American public that hasn't, I think, in recent days been thinking very much about Ukraine. But two, we wanted to try to promote a private sector investment in Ukraine, which I think can go much further even than philanthropy. I think you need both. But I think having businesses actually invest in Ukraine, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from it. So when I was over there and I had a chance to see some of the drone innovations that Ukraine has been making on the front lines, I'll ask, what do you think their iteration cycle is? So in order to get essentially new features and some new capability of a drone, how long do you think that cycle takes?
Well, I mean, the Ukrainians have become the arguably leaders of drone warfare. Their in-house capabilities have become largely self-sufficient in the past couple of years alone. They're, advising countries, be it Germany or even the Saudis. I don't know if that answers your question, but the point is that they're very capable of producing drone interceptors as well. So not very long.
So there, well, exactly, but it's not. But it's not like a difference of like a few weeks here and there. The Ukrainian iteration cycle is 2 to 3 weeks. That means every 2 to 3 weeks they're able to bring new capabilities online. In the U.S., we will be lucky if in the defense sector our iteration cycle is somewhere between 6 months to a year. That would be considered amazing. Like we would be lucky if that were the iteration cycle. In reality, our iteration cycle tends to be incredibly slow. And part of it is because we don't have the type of feedback loop that Ukrainians have, right? So they are developing drone, we looked at some of their drone R&D in labs that are just miles away from the front lines. So, you basically develop drones, you send them out, and within a day, you get immediate feedback about how effective or ineffective they are on the front lines in combat. The US, we don't have that type of feedback loop. And so one of the things that I want to explore is how do we get a feedback loop of that nature here in the US, right? What the Ukrainians need is scale. In order to scale, they need capital, which is something we have, the U.S. meaning, the West, we have in spades. And what we need is innovation. We need to be ready for the next major power conflict, which right now I think we're woefully underprepared for. So kind of going back to your question, what do I think of with respect to Ukraine as being this front line of freedom? Well, I think of it actually as an I think it can play an incredibly complementary role to what we have in the US and the UK and Europe, et cetera, where we can help them scale, they can help us innovate. Oh, and I should say the last thing for the delegation. So I mentioned the private sector piece, and I mentioned bringing Ukrainian voices to the West. I should say also that RDI has invested over $15 million in humanitarian support to frontline regions in Ukraine, with the goal of trying to fill gaps left behind by the bigger organizations like the Red Cross. Groups like that tend to avoid getting anywhere near front lines for understandable reasons. And so we make sure that our aid goes as close to the front as we can to ensure that Ukrainians can stay on their own land without becoming refugees in the first place.
Very, very pertinent indeed. So quite nicely, I think. What do you think that Ukraine and the war itself reveals about the relationship between, say, national identity and democratic survival?
I mean, I think the two are inextricably linked. The mistake. And so, you mentioned both Biden and Trump, and I actually think that both administrations were going about things the wrong way. And so as it relates to national identity, this is a perfect example. The Democrat, generally speaking, the left, let's say, tends to think of national identity as something basically not to talk about. Instead, let's talk about just values of democracy and, these really highfalutin principles. But, we don't need to talk about anything resembling nationalism, right? We can talk about identity in the form of racial identity or class identity, et cetera, but again, not national. And the right essentially does the exact 180-degree reverse. The only thing that matters is national identity and nationalism above all else, right? Above the principles of democracy and so forth. And what I think Ukraine shows is how you can absolutely have the two of these things not only coexist, but how you can have each of them support the other. They have, groups like Azov, the Azov Brigade, which is a nationalist entity. It's certainly not, the type of Nazi entity that Russian propagandists would have you believe. And in fact, I am clearly a Jew. And yet, when we were in Ukraine, we were visiting with the Azov Brigade, and one of our hosts who took us to a shooting range where we got to see how good we would be on the field. He, obviously he knew that I was Jewish. I tend to have this Jewish star that I wear. And he had no problem with that. But what he explained to us is that many of the folks in the early days of the full-scale invasion were soccer hooligans, and others were people who were absolutely aggressively nationalistic, but who, as part of their identity, in addition to that component of nationalism, of Ukrainian nationalism, also believed in principles that we would consider to be quote unquote Western principles, like the right to vote, free speech, have a pluralistic society, and be welcoming to people like me, be welcoming to minorities. These two things do not have to be in conflict with one another. And at least in Ukraine, they are 100% mutually reinforcing. If you didn't have the type of nationalists of the Azov Brigade, Ukraine would not exist as an entity right now, because you wouldn't have the young men and women willing to fight and die for their country. And if you didn't have the principles that we hold to be sacred in the West, then they wouldn't have anything to die for.
So one of the things that also I've noted a lot is obviously people talk about the extensive corruption within Ukraine, which, I mean, we can't deny that. But what we can also recognize is that they've made concerted efforts to try to deal with that. So, in wartime conditions, even in a country under war, has been trying to make improvements to deal with corruption handling and sort of embezzlement. I'm curious what your thoughts are, like, how well can wartime conditions coexist with democratic accountability more broadly?
Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So there are certain parts of wartime conditions that are actually conducive to democratic accountability, and then there are certain parts that are the exact opposite. So as it relates to corruption, it's actually, I would say, conducive to accountability, because when your existence is at stake, you are going to be really damn motivated to root out any corruption that would prevent you from being able to defend your people. And so we have seen massive anti-corruption efforts on the part of Ukrainians. And in fact, there was a moment a while back when President Zelensky tried to hamstring the most prominent anti-corruption organization in Ukraine called NABU. He tried to essentially bring them under his control. There were massive, relatively speaking, protests on Ukrainian streets. Thousands of people gathered to protest his actions in the middle of a war. So that means these folks, when they were gathered, I mean, they are targets for Russian drones and Russian strikes, and yet they were still willing to take that risk in order to prevent anything that might bring back the type of corruption that we've seen in that part of the world historically. And President Zelensky, within a couple of days, essentially said, you know what, you're right, I was wrong, I'm not going to take this action, and this entity, NABU, was able to maintain its independence. So I think actually the Ukrainians deserve a lot of credit for their anti-corruption efforts. I don't think it's perfect. I think corruption still exists over there. It's kind of a continuing fight. But, that's something that's also true in the free world. And, one of the jokes that kind of I've been making recently is that the difference between Ukrainian corruption and American corruption is that today corruption in Ukraine is illegal. In the US, it's not so clear, right? I mean, I think back to the first few days after the election, how many billions of dollars did Trump's family earn from Trump coin, a cryptocurrency that essentially formalized a bribery process, right? And how many tens of millions of dollars have been made, hundreds of millions of dollars have been made by people in Trump's inner circle, billions of dollars often. And lastly, I think how many billions of dollars have been made on the market as a result of foreknowledge of Trump's market-moving announcements. We saw trades worth hundreds of millions of dollars before Trump made announcements around the war in Iran, around tariffs, etc. So clearly people are cashing in, and they're just doing it perhaps in a slightly more sophisticated way than what we would think of as corruption traditionally.
No, certainly, and NABU is the example that I was thinking of. What was that, about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago? I remember it very vividly. Them being, I think it was like 100,000, 200,000 Ukrainians came out around Kiev and other parts of the country to really put pressure on the Zelensky government to make to walk that back, to change that. But I guess what I'm also interested from you then, as Ukraine as a symbol, has it strengthened the democratic case globally, or do you think it's exposed democracy's vulnerabilities and pushed more countries away from wanting to seek it as a model of governance?
I think the answer is both. So look, on the one hand, long-term war is not conducive to democratic conditions, right? Ukraine is a democracy, no question, but it's under martial law, which is understandable. Like there's no safe way to conduct elections right now in Ukraine. So there are inherent challenges during wartime. Think back to the American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln didn't respect habeas corpus. And again, he did so, but basically, and he even said that he would abrogate the Constitution in order to save the Constitution. Globally, is it an inspiration or is it a deterrent? I think it depends whom you ask. I think for some people, when they look at the courage and the innovation exhibited by the Ukrainians in the face of what is just unquestionably an assault by a dictator, I think a lot of people are inspired by that. I mean, I can certainly speak for myself. I think it's inspiring for me, for my organization, for a bunch of folks in the US, and for countries. I talked to Bobby Wine, for example, in Uganda, and Bobby absolutely talked about being inspired by the Ukrainian struggle. But the flip side, and what we need to prevent, is for countries to take the opposite lesson, which is to say, look, we don't want to risk the anger of a dictator like Putin, or else we're going to get attacked and the free world won't come to our defense, right? Like that would be the worst precedent that could be set here, is this idea that dictators are united and are willing to help one another, but that democracies and that free countries are kind of, if you have a problem, then you're on your own, right? Every man for himself. That's the kind of, I think, intuition that we need to prevent from taking hold, both in existing free countries, so that we don't suddenly start seeing countries like Canada start kowtowing to China, which actually we have started seeing, and so that we don't see sort of developing democracies in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South America, start thinking that maybe they should turn to Russia, China, and these other authoritarian states as more reliable partners than countries like the US.
Yeah, and of course, when we're talking about democratic transitioning, be that towards, but also unfortunately with backsliding, a recent example of the power of democracy in action and a win is, of course, Hungary. The election from just over 2 weeks ago is a huge deal. I myself made a video covering it, and it got a lot of engagement because people were seeing Hungary as such a symbol of a country which is supposed to be a democracy, but also been under the leadership of one guy 16 years and is effectively this hybrid regime, this illiberal democracy, as Orban himself, I think, coined it. So, when you look at a country like Hungary that has been on the precipice for such a long time, what do you sense there?
So it's not just that Orban was in power for a long time, right? Like you can be in power for a long time and still have a democracy. I mean, FDR was president for, up until his death, but for right around 16 years, right? And so the problem with Orban wasn't that he was in power for so long. The problem with him is that he essentially got rid of any and all checks and balances, right? He took control of state media. Basically 80% of media in Hungary was under the control of Orban or one of his allies. He actively made life difficult and well, I mean, again, that's an understatement, but he actively threatened anyone whom he perceived to be a political opponent. He engaged in what essentially was overt corruption, and he exercised power in a way that was much more reminiscent of a dictator than of the leader of a free country. So it's, I think that's kind of the important distinction to make. And these last elections, the fact that Orban was defeated by, incidentally, a former protege of his, right? The ultimate victor, Magyar, was somebody who was very close to Orban up until 2024. But this election was a free election, but it was not a fair election. Right. Orban put his finger on the scale as much as he possibly could. He got infinitely more media coverage than his opponent, and he threatened those who supported his opponent. They gerrymandered Hungary. They organized the districts in Hungary such that it gave a massive advantage to Orban's party, Fidesz, in parliamentary elections. And yet, despite all of that, the pro-democracy opposition, I say pro-democracy, by the way, but not left-wing. They're not liberal in the sense that you or I would, use that term, Magyar is a conservative guy. I mean, this is a right-wing party that won, but it's a right-wing party that believed in the principles of an open pluralistic society and a democratic process. And the fact that they were able to unite all these different disparate oppositions, basically people recognizing that, look, you and I might disagree on X, Y, or Z, but we can set aside those disagreements for now and unite in order to take out a greater threat to our freedom and our country than sort of what we would be to one another. That's something that more countries in this position have to do. I quite frankly wish that the opposition in Israel would do something similar. They have been sort of unable to unite in that way. And the fact that they were able to focus in a very disciplined fashion, they did not talk about big picture principles, values, democracy. I mean, Magyar referenced them here and there, but for the most part, he focused narrowly on the things that were most important to the Hungarian people. He didn't talk about Ukraine. He didn't talk about the international community. He focused on pocketbook issues. He focused on corruption. He focused on the fact that Hungarians today are worse off than they were 16 years ago. And that clearly resonated with the public, whereby he didn't just win, he won by an unbelievable landslide, which, by the way, is the only reason Orban conceded. Right? If Magyar had won by anything less than 10 percentage points, I think Orban would have tried to stay in power and fought it tooth and nail. But Orban simply could not overcome that type of landslide victory. And the last note I'll make here, because the Schadenfreude was just so incredible, was I'd encourage your audience to watch this. There's this 3-minute clip of Magyar talking for the first time with what essentially amounted to Orban's state media. And for 3 minutes, he essentially just berated them and politely, I should say, very, very properly was like, look, you guys have become a megaphone of the outgoing regime. And truth be told, within a few months of when I take power, you will cease to exist. It is not okay in a free society to have a state propaganda service meant to target its own citizens. Anyway, so I encourage you to take a look at the 3-minute clip. I found it, very entertaining.
Yeah, I think it's I find it frustrating, and I'm glad you made the distinction that because Magyar was part of Orban's broader system at one point, that he's sort of exactly the same. I think that's a bit of a lazy argument. Is the guy a bit of a populist, perhaps, but he's still a pro-democracy populist, and he's certainly nothing like Orban. You can be, I feel that, you either have to be liberal and therefore some sort of democracy supporter, or you're right-wing and therefore you're anything but democracy. That's not necessarily the case. You can still be centre-right, but be supportive of the principles and values of democracy. And I think Peter Magyar is an illustration of that.
And by the way, you can be left wing and be anti-democracy, right?
Nice.
The Venezuelan dictatorship is not a right-wing dictatorship. The Cuban dictatorship is not right-wing. And in fact, there's an argument to be made that when you devolve into communism, it's actually much harder ultimately to recover. The fact that Hungary can recover from this, that it can recover from Orban, means that there's still something to work with. There's still the sort of basics of a system in place now, despite Orban's best efforts to sort of destroy everything. But when you get a totalitarian leader, someone whose goal is not only the preservation of their own power, but also an effort to control the very thinking of their public, it is much more difficult to recover from that. And so you look at communist dictatorships, and it's very, very rare that you, at least so far in our history, that we have seen communist dictatorships recover to something resembling a liberal society.
Well, there is the idea of the horseshoe theory, whereby the far left and the far right are not that really much different. And if you look at how much destruction Stalin and Hitler caused in their respective ways, they're not really that different. They're both the worst of humanity, and one's far left and one's far right. But certainly, I think that's a very important point. And on that, actually, I guess as one of my final questions really is simply, Hungary is an illustration of a country that saw its democracy gradually etched away, hollowed out, but has demonstrated that it came back with a vengeance, and it was very much resilient. But we're also seeing someone else try to do that in the United States. And obviously that's where we both were speaking with one another in person. And so when you apply the principles of Hungary to what Trump's doing in America, how do you see it?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're a nonpartisan organization, right? My interest is in defending the key principles that have allowed us to be so successful, that have allowed us to be rich and powerful, and for me to be able to say whatever I want on the street and not have to worry. And yeah, for the first time, I think, in history, we're really seeing that, certainly since the Civil War, I would say, we're really seeing that devolve in the US in relatively comprehensive terms. And so, look, I'm not going to go, and list all of the ways in which that Trump, I think, is trying to undo the democratic building blocks of the United States. I think, people are either going to agree with me or disagree, but I do think it's relatively clear what he's doing in the sense of, like, right now they're reviewing NBC's license, or ABC or NBC, I don't remember which, actually, for Jimmy Kimmel, as a result of what he said, a clear attack on free speech. And I'll tell you transparently, the number of people that I've heard from business leaders who have said that they are afraid to speak out, that they are afraid to give money to organizations for fear of repercussions from the Trump administration, that number has skyrocketed. And, there's always a threat from, you never want to be the enemy of the president of the United States. But never before have you had a United States president leverage power in the way that Donald Trump is leveraging power, where his goal is self-aggrandizement. I mean, I look at the banners in downtown DC, and it is like, it's literally out of the Soviet Union. My parents are from the former Soviet Union, and, you see these massive banners that they had unfurled in Moscow, and suddenly that's what we're seeing in downtown DC. You see Trump's usage of the military, the threats against those who disagree with him, the recent indictment of James Comey, the former FBI director whom Trump sees as an enemy. Long story short, all of these things represent a fundamental threat to American democracy that is borderline unprecedented in our history. Now, the lesson that we should be taking from Hungary is a few things. So first, it is the fact that there's hope. There's no such thing as the fat lady having sung, the story's not over, and that we can come back from this. That's number one. Number two, we are not actually anywhere near as bad as what Hungary was near the end of Orban's rule. We have not gotten to that level yet. Right? Things are bad. They are not that bad yet. And so there's still even more opportunities to stop it. But now, in terms of those who are opposed to these types of excesses that Donald Trump has been doing, we need to be infinitely more pragmatic than we've been. And so when I see elements of the far left, for example, lift up the likes of Hassan Piker, who is this, increasingly famous left-wing podcaster in the US, alarm bells are going off in the back of my mind, because I mean, if I were to put up quotes from Hassan Piker and quotes from Tucker Carlson and get rid of the names behind them, you would not know who said what. To your point about horseshoe theory, it's almost exactly the same. And it has Hassan Piker represents a real threat to any type of kind of pro-liberal, in the classical sense of the word, pro-liberal unity. And so the single greatest danger facing anyone who opposes Donald Trump, especially Democrats, is if you go too far into an ideological extreme right now, you are going to alienate people who would otherwise be your allies. And the thing that we need most of all right now is unity in defense of our freedom. And number two is we need to be pragmatic in defense of our freedom. We need to be willing to make compromises and to do what needs to be done recognizing that we're facing, what I think is a genuinely existential threat. And then last but not least, we need to offer a positive vision. It's not enough to simply say, look, the other guy's bad, vote for this guy or that guy or whomever. You have to offer people something to fight for, not just something to fight against.
Absolutely. It's quite a pertinent point by which to end on, I think, Uriel. If you only give people a sense of hopelessness or doom and gloom, as our current government has in the UK, then people turn to the fringes. They turn to the polls, and you need a sense of unity, a sense of vision, a sense of hope. Otherwise, what else do you have? But Uriel Epstein, CEO and founder of Renew Democracy Initiative. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. A long time coming to have you back, and I'm sure we will have you back in the coming days and weeks ahead to touch base on some of the work that you're doing, and also, of course, bringing on some of the great staff and people that you've honoured as part of the organisation as well in the fight for democracy. And I look forward to all of that, and everyone else for watching. Do check out the RDI's work, and of course, your magazine, your newsletter is The New Move, right?
The Next Move. So the nextmove.org, and the whole premise of the Next Move, as we're talking about these strategies, the Next Move is literally created in order to think about a strategic approach to how we can not only save democracy, but again, I'd be remiss not to say renew democracy, right? The whole idea is it's not just to preserve something that existed before, but it's really to think ahead as to, what can we build? What is that positive vision of a future that we can build together? So I encourage folks to visit thenextmove.org, founded, of course, originally by Garry Kasparov, the former world chess champion.
The Grand Chess Master, who I was lucky enough to meet in person, and certainly the link to the Next Move and your great work at RDI will be in the description below for people who want to check it out. But we'll see you all next time, everyone. Thanks for watching. Give the video a like, give it a share, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.